Right, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to how I actually improvise with my right hand, and I think the first thing to say is I am not a fast player, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them was I was completely self-taught and I took up the piano much later at the age of 16, and I probably taught myself very bad technique and regret giving up piano lessons when I was like 5 or 6 years old, but never mind. And therefore my technique was never particularly good anyway, but also I then sustained a number of quite bad injuries on both arms, and this is again sort of slowed down progress in terms of like doing lightning fast runs. So yeah, that's fine, because I always I'm interested in the way of kind of adapting. If you've got limits, you know, what could you do to actually then use those limits to your advantage? And so people like Thelonious Monk, for example, and Stan Tracy and Ram Blake, who are not, again, kind of big shredders on the piano, have been big influences for me in terms of how to actually approach this. That's not to say I don't play some fast runs, but a lot of them I've had to kind of work on quite hard, and I'll explain a little bit about that. Now, I went backwards in a way in that I started by transcribing solos, because that's all I really had. I had recordings of people like Oscar Peterson, Fats Waller, eventually Bill Evans, and I just tried to work out what they were doing, learnt kind of licks, learnt them in every key, and then tried to insert them into pieces, which is a way that a lot of people tend to kind of learn initially, which is fine, but it just ends up with lick after lick after lick as a solo. And then later on, I think by absorbing, and I think this is a real key thing, if I was going to give any advice, you just got to absorb certain musicians and just literally live and breathe what they're playing for quite a while. And slowly, I think your mind fills up with these kind of ideas, plus mixed in with your own ideas, and that then comes out as actual, you know, music, rather than here's a lick, and there's a speed run or whatever. So really, but you still need to combine certain techniques. If I was to go back now to when I started to give myself advice, I would definitely work on chord tones first of all. I think that's a very good way of learning jazz. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here, because there are a vast number of very good YouTube channels with loads of videos on how to kind of play chord tones, how to play enclosure patterns, things like the Open Studio, M-Dex is another one, Amy Nolte. All of these people have done absolutely amazing jobs. Noah Kelman, these are phenomenal sort of things with all sorts of resources. So I'll just quickly talk as an overview really. Number one, chord tones. If I was looking at something like Stella, I need to be able to know I need to know those chord tones. I also need to know each chord tone separately, so I need to know the third of each chord in order to start creating kind of lines out of that. The chord tones are the kind of fundamental thing, and I think that's reinforced by a book by Hal Galper called Forward Motion, which goes over the principles of how important it is to understand how to move onto the strong beats of the bar with the kind of chord tones. Again, these are rules that can be broken, but there is a kind of underlying principle in music, from Mozart to Bach to Charlie Parker, where this kind of principle works. So, and really knowing how to land on those chord tones and how that works is very important. But we've also got things like chromatic passing notes and enclosure patterns, and sort of learning how to little exercises like that, just to understand what that was not a very good example, but landing sort of like and using kind of chromatic passing notes when you're improvising is a really important skill to actually develop. So enclosure patterns are quite useful as well. Barry Harris's stuff obviously has become quite big these days. Again, I hadn't really heard of Barry Harris till much later on, to be honest. But his principles, and again, the way he lays out the kind of use of the diminished sixth scales and so on and so forth, I know would have been very useful to me when I'd started learning, just as, again, understanding some principles about how to actually make the phrases work. But there are a few other approaches that I think are more personal to me that I find interesting. One of them is the constant scale exercise. I love that. When I listen to Keith Jarrett, for example, I don't hear loads and loads of bebop stuff. I'm aware that he understands the kind of principles of that kind of bebop language, but there is an absolutely rhapsodic kind of movement to what he does as a piano player that seems to sort of like bypass any kind of cliche. And it always sounds to me like he's playing a continual scale. So one of the exercises that I really liked, which I got from Mark Levine's jazz theory book, was to just play crotchets on every single beat, basically, going up the mode until you get to the next chord. And then when you're on the next chord, you simply just play on the next consecutive note of that scale. In order to do that, you obviously have to understand the theory of what scale goes with what chord. And again, from a diatonic sort of like point of view, there are ways of understanding that. You know, the diatonic sequence, which actually I'll talk about in a book review I'm going to do as the next video. But basically, so long as you actually understand your scales, you can then move through each of these modes, and it actually allows you then to play a sort of line. Kind of like moving through changes, and a lot of that came from my practicing that kind of constant scale as much as I could to really get into be able to sort of create what feels like one particular scale. Another idea that I use a lot is what I call common tones. So when I've got a sequence, for example, the first 4 bars of Stella by Starla, which I'll keep using, and I've got E minor 7 flat 5, A 7 flat 9, C minor 7, F 7. You know, are there some common tones that I can actually use to kind of anchor my lines? So, for example, I might use A as a common tone. I know I can use A as the kind of 4th of E minor 7 flat 5, the root of A 7 flat 9, the 6th, really nice kind of Miles Davis note there, of C minor 7th as a Dorian, you know, and then the 3rd of F 7th. Now, I can't do it again, obviously, on the next line, but I could shift up to B flat. Another sort of technique, and you'll notice if you look at my version of My Romance that I recorded and one of the uploads, that I do, because actually you can find that you often in some songs you can actually hold a single note through the whole thing, and it can be used as just a kind of technique to kind of anchor things, but you could also make a kind of blatant sort of like feature of it, which is what I did. And again, that sort of it's not so much trying to get me out of being able to sort of, you know, play lots of sort of scales and so on, but it's a kind of, I think, an interesting way of approaching it rather than just sort of blowing through a load of changes. I'm recording this last part about several days after we were recording the first part of this video, just because I managed to mess it up and then we lost part of the video. So I'm still wearing the same jumper to give the illusion of continuity at least. Anyway, I wanted to just conclude on a couple of things that were not really to do with particular techniques, but more a kind of vision of a way of being, really, in terms of playing jazz. And this is for any instrument, not just the piano. The first one is physical, and I would completely acknowledge the original head of jazz at this university, Dr. Rod Payton, who I was getting very much into kind of all the scales, and it's got to be this mode over this, and melodic minor this, and blah, 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 and getting very hung up on actually how to improvise again. And I remember him coming in and saying, look, just let your fingers dance across the keyboard. And I like that idea, but I was kind of immature, so I sort of ignored it for several years. And then much later on, I actually then spent a long time looking at every single key and seeing what my fingers actually wanted to do physically, like rhythmically and physically. So playing like a static rhythm part of one particular chord like C minor. And actually sort of seeing what my fingers genuinely would naturally do if you just set off a kind of swing on one key, and then the next, you know, like a B flat Dorian, and you know, and each key basically had a sort of different sort of almost like dancing space that you could kind of create. So I spent quite a long time, and actually a lot of my playing is really based on the work that I did there. It kind of almost knocked out a lot of the riffs and licks that I was sort of like using at that point, and kind of got subsumed under more of this, what I call kind of pattern playing, I guess, which is sort of allowing your fingers to physically move. And that would work on the saxophone, you know, the violin, the drums. You know, if you look at physically the way different drummers actually move on their drum kits, you know, there's every one of them has got a particular individual take that's very, very physical. You know, or say Bill Evans compared to Thelonious Monk, you know, where Bill Evans is sort of down here and Monk is kind of like got this very angular thing with his foot going backwards and forwards. This kind of physicality is like a really important part, again, of developing your voice. And I think it then starts integrating a lot of things into how you actually play. So that'd be the first thing, is to sort of allow your fingers to dance over your instrument and actually sort of get into the physicality of each key and chord type, not trying to do lots of changes, perhaps taking some time out just to play over a D Dorian and, you know, an E flat Dorian and, you know, G altered or whatever, and, you know, spend like 5 minutes just playing a static swinging G altered chord and see what you actually might do. So that would be one thing which I found very, very useful myself. And the second one is more of the sort of spiritual. So if we talked about the physical, the spiritual. Now, I'm using the word spiritual in an incredibly broad way here. It doesn't have to mean religious, it doesn't have to mean sort of otherworldly or anything like that. It can just mean like sort of getting into the flow state or getting into the zone or getting into a kind of like, you know, musical trance or whatever. I have uploaded a video on the Performing with Confidence set, one on practice, which actually goes into the sort of flow state, or at least the physical side of things, and I've also uploaded one on the actual zone and the flow state and how I used to sort of practice that. But really what you're looking at here is a kind of spiritual aspect of all the assimilation of all of the kind of things that you've learned and the kind of physical aspects of the playing. How you can then transmit that onto the actual instrument again. And a lot of that is to do with basically trying to cut yourself out from the actual playing, as in your inner chatter. So if you were playing like a riff that was, you know, not particularly complicated, for example, but it was really kind of flowing and it was really grooving, that kind of voice that's going, no, I better actually play a really, really fast run because people are listening, which completely knocks you out of that groove. So there's this whole sort of side of things, which is basically that thing of being able to kind of let go into the performance state. And that is something that takes a lot of practice. And with that, I would suggest that that's more to do with jamming. I think it's really, really useful and kind of essential, basically, to get together with other musicians, either of the same standard as you or a slightly higher standard, which always kind of pushes you forward, and actually play a lot with them. And not trying to get really good performances necessarily, but just learning to be in the performance state, perhaps in front of other people if you can do as well. And I think that is the kind of like the final piece of the puzzle, really. You can do as much practice as you want in a practice room and sort of learning all these patterns, but actually throwing yourself out there and sort of like getting together with like-minded musicians and then gigging or at least jamming on a regular basis is the other part of this, really, that you want to kind of work with. And that all sort of like develops this kind of alchemical sort of process of eventually being able to sort of play and you know, find your voice as a jazz musician. So really that's how I wanted to sort of conclude this particular subject. Thank you very much.